Hello and welcome to this installment of the Great Lakes Reading Series. My name is Julianne Russo, and today I will be co-hosting this segment. I have three well-known Canadian poets here, and I'll start things off by introducing our host. Joining us today is talented writer, editor, and the publisher at Black Moss Press, Marty Gervais. Thank you for joining us, and I will turn things over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Julianne, and welcome, poets, John B. Lee, and welcome, Bruce Meyer. Two fabulous poets and two very, very good friends, and I've been publishing their work with Black Moss for a number of years, and John is joining us from Port Dover, and Bruce is joining us from Barrie. And I mean, the wonderful world of Zoom that we can, connect with poets. And I know that John and Bruce are also friends and share lots of stories and travels together. I remember when we went on a train ride all the way to Ottawa and read poetry to passengers. I mean, we maybe forced poetry on them, I don't know. But we had lots of fun doing that, and then we read in Ottawa, the three of us. So I'd like to begin. Both of you have new books out with Black Moss. John's book, the book is called Something Else, and it's a book of poetry, and it's brand new. It's just coming out now. This fall with Black Moss Press, and Grace of Falling Stars. Thank you, John. And Grace of Falling Stars has just came out in the spring of Bruce's newest work, poetry. And I'd like to begin with asking both of you about the titles and how the titles came about. So let's begin with Bruce. How did you come with that?
Well, your intern editors in the publishing practicum got a lump of material, and I kind of had a working title for it, which was Postcards from Heaven, and I wasn't sold on that. And they whittled down this huge lump of about 200 pages or more of poetry, and they chose a poem that was actually a finalist for the Bridport Prize about two or 3 years ago. And the poem was Betting on Horses. And there's a line on that in that poem that talks about the fact that the horses' tails, are flying after them with the grace of falling stars. And they didn't tell me what the title was, but suddenly out of nowhere one day they said, okay, your book's going to be called Grace of Falling Stars. I thought, what a great title, so I was quite happy with that. So they were the ones that came up with it. Mermaids of the Sacred Heart was tossed around, and a couple of other ones were tossed around, but Grace of Falling Stars just seemed to sum up the book, and I think they nailed it. So,
well, Mermaids of the Sacred Heart is a title that I would love to steal from you. And
go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, I told you that back then, and I thought, wow, what a great title. I'll just have to write a book of poems to fit the title. That's the only thing. Before we move on to have you read some poems, I thought maybe I'd just turn to John and ask him, now, where did this title come from, John?
Originally, the suite of poems that ended up being called Something Else, I was originally calling it Be Quiet, Sit Down, The Reason Is You Are Drunk, and This Is the Edge of the Roof, which is a line from a translation of a Rumi poem by Robert Bly. And what I liked about that title was everything, except when you told me, well, it's a wonderful title, but I can't remember it. Why don't you call it something else? And so I said, okay, let's call it Something Else. And of course, you were just saying something in passing, and I thought, well, what a wonderful title, Something Else. Turns out that it's actually also the title of one of my an album by one of my favorite bands from the 1960s, the Kinks, whose one of their best albums was called Something Else. And what I thought about the title when I stole it from your incidental comment was the phrase, "My goodness, you're something else," that a mother might say to a child. And also, there's something else I have to say, and so on. So I think it's very summative, and it has all of that idiomatic beauty to it, and it's easy to remember, which is the reason that you suggested I come up with something else in the first place.
Well, thank you for sharing those stories. So let's begin with a poem, and I was going to ask maybe Bruce to start us off with a poem, one of my favorite poems in this book. And in the process of editing, this poem almost didn't make it into the book, and the poem is called "No Hands."
I didn't like it. I at first, it was in my sort of junk heap, and just to what John said, when my mother was mad at me, she called me Bobby. And I said, "Who's Bobby?" And she says, "What are you doing here?" So, anyways, this is No Hands. This is a poem that's essentially about that moment when you learn to ride a two-wheeler and you suddenly realize you can take your hands off the steering, off the handlebars, and let it go from there. No hands. As soon as the training wheels came off, having learned to balance on two thin tires, my friends taught me the art of flying. Closing my eyes, letting go of handlebars, feeling the wind against my face. Down long-hilled streets, pedaling up again. How a tilt of the head or a shift in weight could negotiate a broad suburban curve. If I spread my arms and closed my eyes, I thought I'd catch tomorrow in the rush. So knowing how to ride a bike is an art one never loses, yet feels when it is gone. Part of the body, like a language one speaks. Why birds spread their wings to catch the feelings of forever before they fall to earth.
Mm-hmm. It's such a lovely poem, and the reason why that I like it is because in some ways, to me, it's almost Hemingway-esque in the sense that, where Hemingway, in a lot of cases, would write about writing and about the art of writing. And when you have that line, "Is the art one never loses yet feels when it is gone." I mean, that's so much like Hemingway. It's the whole element of trust and risk, of the risk of putting your thoughts, into a line of poetry, into a line of fiction or whatever. And I mean, it kind of reminds me, even in The Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway is in so many ways was writing about the art of writing. And so it's drawn to.
I lost, speaking of that, it's uncanny that you mentioned that, because I lost the ability to read and write for 4 months in 2015 when I was in a car accident. And it was freaky, because I knew that there were words on the page, but I couldn't put them down, and I didn't know how to pick them off and sound them out and everything like that. And in front of my students, I had to have them fake it. So I had to fake it. So I'd ask them to read the PowerPoint slides that I'd prepared, previous year. So the students would read the lessons, and I'd say, "That's good. Yeah, there you go." Okay. Language is precious,
It is. And I'm going to ask John, if you wouldn't mind reading in your new book. The poem is called "My Father's Fridge," and I think I know that fridge. I've been to your house. This was after everyone had moved out, I think, and I remember opening that fridge, and there was a mouse frozen in there. I don't know whether you remember that. And I remember you using a chisel or something to try and dislodge this crazy mouse. But the reason why I like this poem, I'll just say this by way of introduction, and I have no idea whether you've meant it in that way, but it's really for me, about the secrets that we carry with us. The things that define our life, the things that are personal, sometimes the indignities of that personal side of ourselves, but also, you know, some of the pleasures. And so, I mean, when I'm reading that poem, especially where you get toward the end of the poem, this is what I'm gathering from it. But let's hear it. My father's fridge.
That's a wonderful interpretation. Before I read the poem, I want to say something briefly about Bruce's poem and how much I envy you for having the ability to ride a bicycle without holding the handlebars with your hands. It's something that I've never managed to do, but I never really quite understood why it was necessary anyway. It makes sense to hold on to the handlebars to me.
You have to be heading downhill. So.
Okay, well, I would likely fall halfway down. Wibble wobble, fall. My father's fridge. My father's fridge sat in the back shed off the kitchen, there on cold cement, and the smoke smells and straw scents of men come in from the barn, where the collie dog slept on the hard floor when the winter howled at the door, by the spikes hammered into the wall, with ardocks for hooks and swill stink of sour water and galvanized pail, and apple scraps, potato peels, and the oleo gustus of rancid lard floating in white islands on the surface, small monocles of spoiled fat meant for the hogs in the yard. And what he kept in there, mostly what my mother refused to allow in the house, bad things, the noisome milk rot of Limburger and blue mold bruised in small cakes, and the sharp clabber of old cheese, and beer gone skunky in squat bottles, medicines blended for worming the sheep, nicotine vermicides, and vials for dosing the cattle, Yo's milk meant to be warmed for the lambs, orphaned by mastitis and the untimely death of their mothers. And the damned fridge sometimes shorted, so teasing the chromium handle in wet socks would send an unpleasant shiver, a cruel metallic tremor shocking the bones with a warning, noli me tangere. And now it has all vanished, like the plowed under autumn darkness of a midnight field. My father working the land in the late hours, the ghost light of his labor dimming to nothing, turning away in the distant, come close as he leaves.
Nice. Oh, lovely poem. And so let's move on. John, maybe you can read another poem, and which I find really haunting, actually. It's a poem called If This Is a Poem, and then it's a miserable failure. The poem is so haunting and in some ways very, very disturbing, and it opens up that way. I'll just let you read it, and then we can talk about it for a minute.
Yeah, the title of this poem comes from a friend of mine who said of one of the poems that he's seen. He said, if this is a poem, then it's a damn failure, because that particular poem did not, partake in the traditional metrics and rhyme schemes of relatively formal poems that he was used to. But I thought it's a good poem, or it's a good title for talking about those things that we talk about at our peril. And so this is based on a true story of the children of the commandant of Auschwitz. If this is a poem, then it's a miserable failure. The children of the concentration camp commandant were always warned by their loving mother that they were playing in the gardens of Auschwitz under the chimney shadows of the crematorium. Always wash the ashes from the strawberries before you eat them, my dears. Imagine those small, succulent, seed-red, heart-shaped delicacies, the sweet and pulpy delights, fruit of the rose, a crimson temptation floating in straw, how they come to the hand from the earth, to the tongue of the child, how they weep on the chin as though watered in tears. Though the ravenous birds of the air eat the berries unwashed in the garden of death, though it snows in the summers of Europe, though they taste the darkness at noon. And of course, that last phrase is an allusion to one of the books written by a Holocaust survivor, and his book was called Darkness at Noon. So I thought that was an appropriate way to end that particular poem.
Well, thank you. As I say, it's really disturbing. And, you know, when I think of Auschwitz, I remember I visited Auschwitz many years ago. When I went to Krakow, and I made the trip out there, and I was on a little tour of it, but there were only like 3 or 4 people on this tour. What struck me was that the people who had the, I guess it would be the security people, the people who were in charge of the place to watch over it, their whole family lived in a house on the grounds of Auschwitz. And what struck me was the children's playground behind it. And can you imagine your children growing up at Auschwitz and playing out there in the yard and going off to school? It just seems so incongruous. But Bruce, I want to turn to you. You have a poem in this book, A Grace of Falling Stars. It's a poem at the end called Going to Heaven. And I remember seeing this poem initially in the original manuscript, and it struck me, not just because of the title, but it struck me that in some ways a lot of what you're writing, you go at it with, there's a kind of spiritual foundation to your writing. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but also let's just hear the poem Going to Heaven.
Okay, yeah. This is Going to Heaven, and this was intended to be in the manuscript. So it was always intended to be the last poem in the manuscript. Going to Heaven. I was commuted on that winter morning as I watched the passengers at each stop and wondered who would go to heaven. This is not a question I'm permitted to ask. I'm a poor judge of human souls, and worse at knowing my moral faults. But one woman smiled and I smiled back, and I have no idea if either of us possessed the requirements for providence. But as I stood out front Union Station, and the luminous morning left me blind, I mistook wafting angels for flights of snow, and the spark of hope I saw in her eyes broke me open as dawn breaks day.
Lovely.
And I believe that's a sonnet, actually. And sonnets are essentially problem-solving devices. And I always, you wonder about heaven, and you wonder about the existence of spiritual elements in the universe. Or is the spirit in us, or are we reaching out to the spirit and to something larger? And the sonnet is really sort of struggling to sort of find whether or not that's true. And also, if you have religious texts such as the Bible saying, well, you're if you do this, this, and this, you get to go to heaven. Even Virgil does that in the Aeneid in Book 6. But if you do this, this, and the other thing, you get to go to heaven or Elysium or whatever. You can never be sure, because if you're on your way, you can't tell anybody behind you, who's in the lineup behind you. So it becomes a conundrum, and that you're speaking to something that is essentially amorphous, and that puzzles me. We tend to want to address concrete things, but it's that indefinable sort of something out there that sometimes it talks to you, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it works, sometimes it explains what happens, sometimes it doesn't. And it's a strange sort of battle. I mean, I've been through United Church, and I've been through the Anglican Church and the Catholic faith and so forth, and having looked at all of them together, there's a sense that they're all pointed in the same direction, but they're all asking the same questions. But the question they can't answer is, what's beyond us? And that's it's a troubling question, and the questions of the spirit are troubling. And somebody told me once recently that my poems are troubling, and I thought, good. So
well, they provoke, and they provoke people, and they make them think, and that's good. Let me ask both of you, this is a question we hadn't really discussed, but it's a question that I had that was put to me the other day about something that I've written. So I want to ask you, what do you like about your books? These two particular titles. I mean, my feeling that A Grace of Falling Stars by you, Bruce, and Something Else by you, John, are the finest books of your work that I've seen to date. That's what I think. What is your feeling when you open up that box of books and you pull this book out of that box? What do you think? What's your reaction to it?
Well, I think mine was that this is a book about wonder, and I think I'd always been sort of skirting around the issue of wonder, and I think this is the one book that really jumps in and tries to address what wonder is. I don't want to use the word magic because that's too hocus pocus and rabbit out of the hat sort of thing, but the sense of I think that the awe of the actual life, the awe of daily life is very, very important. And that seemed to be what I came out of the poems. I mean, I was just writing them because I was interested in this idea or this topic or that topic, or was a memory or something like that. But when they were all added up, the ones that were chosen by the intern editors were the ones that were dealing with a kind of a sense of journey through awe.
Mm-hmm. Good. What about you, John?
I always feel the same way when I get a new book. Wow, my goodness, rediscover the fact that I'm better than I think I am. And another thing about it is that I want to say in response, to be cagey about it, well, you tell me. And in a way, you've just told me that you think this is the finest work I've done to date. And I think that is the wonderful reality of a poet's life, when you remain open to the possibility of getting better and better. We live our lives in the proper direction, unlike athletes who live their lives backwards. Their glory days are all in their youth. I think there's a certain melancholy in a Wayne Gretzky or a Muhammad Ali life, that your youth is when you are in your prime and you are at your physical peak. Whereas I hope that you can you're chasing what you don't know yet. The page is blank in front of you and you chase it. And when it goes well, it's a surprise, and you remain open to that possibility of surprise. I remember when I was a kid, I loved the plays of Tennessee Williams, which I only saw as movies. And one of his movies that really struck me and struck home with me as a 14 or 15-year-old boy was the movie Night of the Iguana. And in that movie, there's a poet, and the poet has lost his ability to write, but he can recite new poems, and his daughter is his amanuensis. And in the movie, he writes one last poem, and it's his best, and his daughter brings him to the little gathering, and he recites his poem, and then he dies. And I thought, that's the life I want. So if this is an apotheosis, I hope that it's not an acme. I hope it's not the peak, because I want to peak just as I'm taking my last breath. Bruce mentions the mystery beyond our understanding, Well, what I haven't written yet is a mystery beyond my understanding. I don't know what it is. I won't know what it is until it comes onto the page. So something else, I thank you. But the minute it comes out as a book, the minute I hold it in my hand, I realize I've given it away. It's somebody else's now. It's the reader's property. And it's almost like it was written by a happy stranger, and now it's time to move on. And I'm grateful for Black Moss and other publishers who honor poetry, but now it's for other people to say how good it is, or where its achievements are and where its failures are. What it was to me as I was writing it, every poem in there was a discovery of things that I didn't quite know yet until they were on the page.
As that old phrase Chaucer has, ars longa vita brevis, and Louis Dudek, I once heard him say that if you're a poet at 20, you're 20. If you're a poet at 40, you're a poet. But if you're a poet past 60, you've got basically something definitely wrong with you, because you're obsessive at that point. But there was also the Walter Delamere story that he tells. Someone said, "What's your best poem?" as he was leaving a dinner party. And he started reading some of the poems. He said, get halfway through, and he said, "No, not that one, not that one." And he said, well, when he got to the end of his sheaf of poems, he says, "Well, I guess I haven't written it yet." And it's always the next one. You always feel that it's like kind of like being a baseball player. Every time you stand in the box, you think the next one's going to leave the park. The next one's going to be the one that goes farther than Mickey Mantle's sort of record shot, and if you don't get it, I mean, you try to get it right every time, but even if you can't get it right, you keep writing, because you just feel that the next one will be the one that everything clicks on. So it is obsessive. Yeah.
The Poet in the Night of the Iguana, and I remember that movie, and I remember I was a teenager and I was at the Norwood Theater in Bracebridge when I saw that movie, and like you, John, I thought, I want that. I want to be that poet. And what I liked about that movie, as I recall, I may be wrong, but this was my impression, is that throughout the movie, he was working on the poem. He kept reciting these lines and working on these lines, and that just really echoed, for me. And I think that's when I decided to not take up my father's idea about becoming a barber, and instead became a poet. So, all right. So let's. I think we've come to the end. This was wonderful. I'm really happy we could share these views, these good words about poetry and these poems. Thank you, John, and thank you, Bruce. And I'll send everything back to Julianne. So.
Yes, and what I would like to do is thank you first, Marty, for hosting this installment, and thank you, Bruce and John. It's always inspiring to not just hear you read your poems, but to hear you talk about the inspiration that goes behind them. And I'd also like to thank all of the viewers for watching and for joining us today. And that's all for today.
And that concludes this installment of the Great Lakes Reading Series. Thanks to the Canadian Council of the Arts and the League of Canadian Poets for their continued support. I'm Julianne Russo.